What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Alex Cuesta Show. How's everybody doing out there on this Wednesday, January 4th of 2023? I almost said 2022 because I didn't have 2023 written here, and I'm a robot and I read it. So 2023, I hope everyone had a good, safe, and happy new year. Before we get into all the fun stuff, like, share, follow, subscribe, rate us 5 stars. Spotify and iTunes, spread this word of mouth. Go find us on the socials at the Alex Cuesta Show. David, you're back again. Why?
I don't know why I'm back again, honestly. I'm doing pretty all right, though.
I didn't ask you.
I know. but it's common courtesy to let people know how you're doing.
I guess. If you're a Pat Gray fan, small talk is a negative, but that's neither here nor there. But Dave, I'm happy you're doing good. We're doing good here. Anyone listening to last week's show, we did not have a guest last week, but we had a pretty good show. We talked about, our Brooklyn Nets who are still been hot. The Jets suck. I don't want to talk about the Jets anymore. And, we just had a really good show there. But this week, I'm pumped to have on our guest this week because I think he's somebody that, if you're on the right, number one, if you don't follow him on Twitter, you're out of your mind. You're getting educated constantly. And he's one of the more intelligent people on the right. Now, we have a lot of smart people on the right, but his political commentary is very good. And there's a reason for that. Because he's a political science professor over at Kentucky State University. He's very well versed in that. He's Wilfred Reilly. He's also the author of Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo. What's going on, Wilfred?
Not much. Thanks for having me on the show, guys.
Absolutely. Pumped to have you on. I will be remiss to mention that he is also a co-host of one of my favorite podcasts. We had Shamika Michelle, who's the other co-host. It's a Cut the Bull podcast. It's also with Charles Love there. It is a great show there. I completely mixed up everything there. If you can piece that together, that would be great. Sorry about that. But it was a great show. And Shamika, if you are listening, take note of the fact that David is here. He dipped out on you and he dissed you on our episode and he faked an illness and he decided not to come on. But David is here, so he likes Wilfred better than you, Shamika.
That is quite an accusation. Quite an accusation.
Extremely bad taste. Now, Shamika, Cut the Bull is one of the favorite sort of media things that I've worked on. Shamika is kind of the real star of the show in that she's easily like Charles is he comes from the broadcasting world. He's an executive right now. Like, I'm a college professor. Shamika's definitely done a lot of jobs at that level, but is also just someone who's going to say kind of her straight out opinion on, the Democrats, the Republicans. We were talking to some black revolutionary once, and she asked him if he'd been raped in jail. And it was just like a totally deadpan, like, there are a lot of risks to the lifestyle you're leading, brother. I mean, it's just it's very enjoyable to work with her. Yeah. So.
And, in the way, when I was talking to Shamika, as I listened to the show, the way I kind of described it, it was like, Shamika is the furthest on the right, and she just kind of says whatever the hell she wants. You are a little more political about what you say, but you still say whatever the hell you want. And then Charles is just kind of there. He's definitely more to the left of you guys, and he's there to kind of keep you guys in order. Whenever he feels it's going a little bit too off the rails, he tries to reel you guys back in, and his goal is to not get the show completely and totally canceled completely because it's something that demonetized because it's something that he said. And I can't imagine that you guys haven't been potentially demonetized a few times because it's been close. It's been touch and go with some things.
Well, I mean, I think the thing with that, and as you guys, I'm sure know, there are ways to get around that. Like if I wanted to seriously start, and all of us are doing pretty well financially, but if I wanted to seriously start making money, I would do the early career Ben Shapiro, where I just start obnoxiously reading ads in the show. Yep. So there's no, and shout to him, it worked. But there's no way that a large corporation can interfere or can blank out parts of the broadcast. And I think there are companies that would be very willing to do that. Interestingly, I don't think Shamika is all that right wing. I mean, like Shepsley is. She's a Republican voter. But I think she just talks like a normal person. And when you're in that Twitter space, you get so used to people saying like the most politically correct HR stuff that you almost forget what normal people sound like.
Yep.
Like the other day, a heated argument broke out on my Twitter because I did a poll of men. And I was like, I don't think most guys are creepy, but of people that are obviously of legal age, they all have jobs, law school graduate on up, which age cohort of women would you rather date? And it was like 20 to 30, 30 to 40. And obviously men were like, Yeah, men were like 20 to 30. I mean, maybe in the upper end of that, but like younger, athletic women. And all of these women started freaking out. Like, that's not I'm wrong.
Yeah.
You're all pedophiles.
Yeah,
80% of men. And it was just like, no, nobody actually believes this. Like, of course, you shouldn't be like driving a nice car around a high school looking for dates, obviously.
Yeah.
But in terms of like, is there anything unhealthy about dating like a first year lawyer as like an older businessman? No.
No,
And it
not
just
at all.
goes on through everything. Like, are your black buddies like me and Charles oppressed? No. I mean,
We're sorry, Wilfred. We're sorry for being, whitish Spanish guys. We have to apologize.
Well, I mean, another thing I said on social media that drew this hysterical reaction of like hundreds of people was just like, and I actually noticed this the other day. It apparently got retweeted by somebody. Originally, it didn't get much reaction, but it was just like, I said that I don't watch movies about slavery or where the lead black character is a butler or something. It was just like, the great human races. I mean, certainly the Latin American combined, Spanish and Indio culture, the whites, the black have been fighting each other for thousands of years. Like, I get it. We lost last time. Like, I don't really want to watch this, like, the whip. And again, like, come on. And it's just, but I think that, and again, the reaction to that was like, you don't understand. The oppression continues today, young brother. But the point is that I think that offline, basic comments like women seem to prefer wealthy men, perhaps a few years older. Men tend to prefer pretty athletic women, although there are different racial preferences and this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Most men prefer women that don't have penises, just like on and on and on down the line. Like these ideas that you see on the last line before I shut up, but these ideas you see on Twitter and Instagram, like genital preference, like, yeah, I'm not saying I'm gay, but I am saying I have no genital preference. And it's like, well, dog, then you're gay.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't distinguish between penises and vaginas, you're either bisexual or gay. I mean, that's what the words mean.
And to your
point, should people just say that?
To your point, it's like when the Donald Trump thing came out with the Access Hollywood video, right? When he was like, grab him right by the pussy. And everyone's like, oh, locker room talk. That's not real. And it's like, go hang out with the group of guy friends that are real friends for 30 seconds and you will hear something significantly worse than what he said. Like real people talk in a very, like real people, not robots, talk in a very much not PC way and in a way that no one should ever read a group of friends group chat because everyone will be fired. If a group chat exists, everyone gets fired from what's said in there because it's not PC. You're all ripping on each other. You're saying the most ridiculous stuff. You don't mean 100% of it. Honestly, you don't mean 100% of it, but you say it because some of it's funny and it is over the top. And yeah, like you said, we don't get that real human talk on Twitter because Twitter, it's either you're saying something to be a troll and an asshole, right? Or you're saying it to be PC and get a message across. And it's all stupid. But speaking about getting messages across, you are the author of 2 books that are currently out there. I mentioned them before, Hate Crime Hoax and Taboo. Hate Crime Hoax, I believe it came out in 2017, Taboo in 2021 or 2020. What was your motivation for writing these? Because if you're on the right, you know about all the hate crime hoaxes. We hear about it all the time, but it's not really widespread. It's kind of covered up by the leftist media. So what was your motivation for writing both of these books?
Well, the hate crime hoax motivation was something very similar to something I'm feeling right now. Like there's a group on Reddit called r/dtrans. And that's a Reddit that consists entirely of people who, to join the Reddit, you have to say, yes, this specific thing has happened to me. I transitioned to attempt to move to another quote unquote gender. And then I began to detransition. And you have to write at least a 2-sentence description of what happened to you. So my assumption would be that almost everyone that's in this group has had this happen, right? But there are 40,000 users of that Reddit forum. And I don't know what the total number of people that have tried physical transition as, teenagers or beyond is in the United States. Like an estimate my doctor gave me when I asked him was 250,000. But that seems like a really huge percentage. So like when people say like, we don't know these numbers on this, there may be 6 or 8 detransitioners. It's like, well, no, there's a group of people online that are formally saying this thing. And the group numbers and the tens of thousands. So anyway, the reason I'm saying this thing, which seems totally unrelated, is that with hate crime hoaxes, I started to notice years ago that a huge number of these cases that were very highly publicized in kind of mass national media as incidents of racial conflict turned out not to be real.
Yep.
So the origin story for the book, I guess, actually, is that as a graduate student in Chicago back around 2012 to 2013, there were 3 very high profile cases like this, like just in the city of Chicago. So the first one was a graduate student at the University of Chicago named Derek Cockley, maybe undergrad student, like younger guy. Mm-hmm. But he claimed that an entire hacker group, which he called the U Chicago Electronic Army, was sort of stalking him. They were messaging him using all these social media apps, and they were telling him they were going to kill him and rape him, like all this terrible stuff. So that was the first case, and this made the front pages of the Tribune, the Sun-Times, if you're familiar with Chicago, like all of the major publications.
Yeah.
The second case of this kind was a club that people I've dated actually used to dance at. It was called Velvet Ultra Lounge. It was right outside the city in one of those leafy suburbs like Oak Forest. The club was burnt to the ground. And this was a very gay-friendly club, not specifically a gay bar, but a lot of LGBT events, so on down the line. Looked exactly like you'd think it would. And upscale, shy burb, a lot of ferns and that kind of thing. And it was burned to the ground, and there were these terrible gay slurs, faggot, quote unquote, and so on, written throughout the building. This was another one of these cases. And there were a couple others. I mean, there was a student at Michigan Tech who, as the story was initially told, had sent out a message on Yik Yak or one of the second tier sort of messaging apps saying he was going to shoot every black student on campus. And all of these, I think the Wall Street Journal picked up on that one. All these were major regional, if not national stories.
Yeah.
And just following these, because I took the Tribune as a newspaper at that time. I was back in Chicago dealing with the illness of the family, my mom's, unfortunately. And I followed all these for a couple of months, and it turned out that just none of them were real.
No.
So like Cockley, apparently for all the U Chicago brains, I mean, that's a STEM school, didn't really know shit about computers. So he didn't know how like IP and MAC addresses work.
Oh my God.
Like he'd been messaging himself from like another machine, but with the same router or something. I forget the full technical explanation, but it was just like computer in his room, like Facebook messages other computer in his room from a different Facebook account. So that they're different accounts, but the IP and probably the MAC are identical. And so the feds, when they get into this, are going to start asking, like, the call's coming from inside the house, right? So everything, like the conservative hacker group, so on, turned out just to be made up. The real issue was that this social justice warrior student had wanted to draw attention to some campaigns, to some issues on the UCHI campus. The Michigan Tech thing was, I don't want to babble endlessly about each one of these, but like the Michigan Tech thing, he originally said after a fight between like black and white fraternities, something like that. The details are a little fuzzy, but he said, I'm tired of this. This is an engineering school. I'm going to shoot every black guy I see on campus a smile tomorrow, instead of like, as opposed to this stupid fist fighting. And like a campus rival of his took that, screenshotted it, and sent it to campus security. And this ended up then going to the police and probably the feds and so on down the line. So a terrorism case grew out of this. And the poor guy was finally able to explain himself, but he had to dig up his social media history. They had to contact the company to see whose posts were accurate. And the Velvet Ultra Lounge case actually is the funniest. The guy just basically burnt down his business, which if you're familiar with Chicago, isn't all that unusual.
Yes.
This came out a couple of years later when his boy was captured in another state on a DUI case with a woman that wasn't his wife, and kind of said, well, I have some information about a major matter you might be interested in. This is like a year and a half down the road.
Wow.
And it turned out that the owner of Velvet Rope Ultra Lounge had been substantially in debt. I don't know to who, but I will say, again, that's not always the best idea in the greater Chicago area.
In Chicago, not good.
Yeah, he apparently had torched his business to, pay off the debt holder who may or may not have been named Vito. It could have just been, the company or whatever. But so the important thing, though, is all banter aside, like all of these just turned out to be completely false. And in at least 2 out of the 3 cases, the hoaxer was relying on this climate in the kind of the university and adjacent areas of, instant credulous belief in anyone who claims to be a victim.
So
And I looked at this.
So I'm curious real quick, and not to cut you off, but
yeah, of course.
this kind of started, and what people don't realize, a lot of people blame, like, the Trump presidency, and you're like, oh, the divide was so big there. That's when racial tension started. But me being a thinking individual and someone that has a memory, when Obama became president is when a lot of this stuff really started to ramp up. A lot of his rhetoric, a lot of his kind of side taking, talking down about the Cambridge police and everything comes to mind, and hands up, don't shoot. I felt like the racial divide really started under the Obama administration. We saw a lot of the social justice stuff really starting there. Now, it ramped up during the Donald Trump presidency because they were trying to paint him and his supporters all as white supremacists and Nazis, and trying to really put that message out there. And in a way, they were successful with that because the leftist media was very much, consistent with it. But did you find that when you were writing the book and looking at it, and it's like a lot of the divide really started under the Obama era and the Obama administration? And do you think that their rhetoric and what they were saying and how they were going about it really made that rift much bigger than it was previous to them?
Well, I think that's a good point. The short answer is yeah. Racial tensions did not begin with Donald Trump in the USA, to say the obvious, even in the recent past. I do want to say one more thing about hate hoaxes before kind of getting into that. So the reason I brought up r/dtrans is that after looking at these three crazy cases and a few others, because I mean, like Chicago, New York, so you've heard of Tawana Brawley, all that stuff. Yep. I became curious about how often this happens. Finally got a summer off as an academic. But the first thing that clued me in was that there were these lists online of hundreds of these cases that had turned out to be public hoaxes. Like there's an entire website called www.fakehatecrimes.org. That's put together by like qualified researchers. Like, I don't know if they're current academics, but like librarians on up, if you look at the categorization of that site. And so when people started saying, well, there are very, very few of these cases, I started thinking, I mean, there's a list of 700 of these cases and so on Reddit. Now, this interestingly is not how I got my cases. I respect those sites a great deal, but I did the independent research process, just searching the terms. You go through Google, so on down the line, all the similar platforms. But I mean, you started looking at a list of 700 of these cases to realize, like, if people are saying, well, this almost never happens, they're using, and this turned out to be true, some very technical definition. Where, I mean, a case is reported by the initial police department as a probable hoax, and then the feds categorize it as a hoax, and then both departments come forward and conclusively say it was proven to be a hoax by the original person who claimed to be the victim. Like, that was one of the big stumbling points, like, last on this. But, like, if someone comes forward and says, I found a noose on, a prominent tree in a collegiate campus.
I found the noose in my garage at a NASCAR event.
Well, but that's exactly right. Like, so there are real questions of categorization. And this is true with a lot of things, by the way, like claims of sexual assault or domestic violence. Yeah. Like, you need to take those dead seriously, but a lot of them turn out not to be, let's say, prosecutable. Yeah. So are they fake? Well, it depends. It's not very often that someone comes forward and just says, I was attacked by 3 guys, and that turns out to be absolutely untrue. What happens is a great deal of ambiguity involving drugs and so on, female initiation of situations that get ugly on both sides.
A lot of embarrassment goes into it in the way of getting out of a really embarrassing situation.
Absolutely. But I mean, like, you saw the Vince McMahon thing on the DV side where, like, his wife pimp slaps him and he hits her back. How would you treat Dana that? White, would you prosecute only him? But at any rate, the question was the same with this in a similarly serious area of law. If someone comes forward and says that they found a hangman's noose on a prominent oak tree on a historically black college campus, and this is universally treated as a hate crime, and it turns out, and it always does, there's something like 140 of these cases, that the noose was left there by a construction company, do you count that as a hoax or not? And it's actually an interesting conversation.
So I'll say this.
Any figure of like 2 excludes all of those.
So interestingly enough, I worked in construction for a little bit.
Okay.
And there was a noose, quote unquote, found on site. They shut down the site, did the whole entire, this is unacceptable, this and that. And one of the guys was like, we use that as a tether. Like, like it's one of the best knots to use to tether up these heavy lead pipes that we use.
Yeah.
It's a form of a slip knot. You're taught how to do those in Boy Scouts. Like, it is a form of a slip knot. It's it's a good hanging one. So it was kind of like, well, we still don't take that. Do we take this seriously? And it's like, we didn't take it down. Sorry. Like, but it's overreactions to that. So, going with your books, how were they received by both the left and the right? Because I can predictably understand how they might be received by the left, right? But the right is always a mysterious case because you have your sections of the right who are really on the left, and then you have your crazy extremists. So how are they received by both sides?
Yeah, I think that's a good and interesting question. Now, so I'm gonna continue my practice of answering like half the last question.
I love it. Go for it.
So, in terms of like racial tensions, like when they took off, what we actually find is that racial tensions got worse starting in about 2012. Which is like, it's a specific year. Like that was Trayvon Martin, I believe. Mm-hmm. And like all of the Black Lives Matter cases started literally the year after that, like Michael Brown, so on down the line. And Barack Obama made what had to be a conscious decision, yes, to come out very publicly about what really were these local police shooting cases and to advance a pretty specific narrative where, I mean, he said, if I had a son, he would have been out there. He would have looked just like Trayvon. Mm-hmm. And that really, it probably is not accurate. I mean, in terms of like, but in terms of like dressed behavior, the fight between Zimmerman and Martin took place at like, you guys might correct this, but 1:30 a.m. Yeah, like, it's really unlikely. Like Barack Obama's son actually would have been out there looking very similar in that neighborhood, like working class, white, Black, Latino area. So, I mean, Obama really, and Barack Obama's discussed like issues he has with his blackness. Am I quote unquote Black enough? I think at some level, Barack Obama is one of the smarter guys to be president. Yeah. In terms of quality of his memoirs, LSAT score. So at some level, he has to know, like, there are less than 1,000 people shot by police every year. You're more likely to be shot if you're Latino or poor white than if you're a Black guy in most regions. Like, the data is available to the president. But I mean, I think he sort of thought, he made one of those brutal calculations you do as a leader. And he said, well, there's no way that I, as a Democratic president who's Black, who's relying on 95% of the Black vote, cannot address this. So as that began, as BLM began, and then as you saw, frankly, the backlash, I mean, with Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, like left and right fighting in the streets, like that's when racial tensions got worse. So I do think you can peg that to a date. And that date has famous terms associated with it, like Ferguson effect and so on. Yeah. All of those slogans, BLM and ALM and so on, are copyrighted and have made hundreds of millions of dollars for specific people. And one additional comment, one of my conspiracy theories is that I really believe a lot of this is tied to the end of Occupy. So, like, one of the few things that I'm radical about is just like basic treatment of the working man in America. Like, I've had construction jobs, too. And like, you get treated like shit. The union will tell you how much money like your arm is worth if it gets cut off. Like the minimum wage. Now, I'm not going to go into like a left wing rant. Your whole audience will hate here. But like the minimum wage in the USA, it was $7.25 when I got out of, not when I got out of high school, when I got out of college. No, law school. I don't want to exaggerate at all, but it still is. Yeah. Like whatever number of years later, like 14. So I'm actually pretty left on some class issues. Like, can we discuss better health care for our veterans or something like that? And for a while, you had all these movements like Occupy or even the early Tea Party that were, however they might have been presented, extremely diverse and that were based on class. Very. In
a lot of ways, very similar.
Absolutely. And there, people were joking about it like, Tea Party BF, Occupy GF. Might be able to buy a house. Yeah, but like, and they were based on taking over land from rich people. Like Occupy Chicago was literally situated on LaSalle Street. So if you wanted to go to an elite job, you had to walk by like these warriors from the other social class sitting there with machetes over their back, beating on drums. And they weren't going to attack you usually, but they would like engage you in debates. They would talk to you. I mean, like, it was this real class movement. It went on for a while, and it spawned things like Occupy Democrats, as lame as that now is. 6 or 7 congressmen, more came out of the Tea Party. And I think at some level, rich people and all these guys, I mean, let's talk Barack Obama, George Bush, almost all of them went to Harvard or Yale. Mm-hmm. I think whether it was conscious or not, the ruling class looked at this and was like, nope. Like, what other issues can we focus on other than this dangerous one?
And keep them off our ass. Let them fight amongst each other again, which is exactly what they did.
Absolutely. No, I mean, like, there's not old school actual Marxists. If you look at, I hate a communist, but if you look at countries that have a coherent working class movement that communism sometimes sneaks into, and where there's a real discussion of class, like Britain, old leftists like backbencher Rids in the UK Parliament hate identity politics because the idea is that like hardworking white men are a huge part of the proletariat, if you want to use that term. So if you're immediately alienating 60% of your best fighters and the guys that have your union jobs, your working class movement is just ass cheeks, like it's not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. So all of this, all the identity stuff strikes me as upper middle class to lower upper class people that aren't going to make any substantive changes. Like medical care for veterans is not high on the Ilhan Omar agenda.
No.
Focusing on this other stuff to virtue signal, to feel good, to remove the key left issues from the table, whatever your explanation for it might be. But that's one of my semi-conspiracy theories that's also supported by a great deal of empirical data.
Yeah, your conspiracy theory isn't conspiracy at all when you know Herbert Marcuse and repressive tolerance and one-dimensional man, because Herbert Marcuse in repressive tolerance quite literally says that they need a new proletariat, that the class struggle isn't real in capitalism. Life is too good for the middle class. So we're going to go to the ghetto population and the students. And what have we seen? We've seen that Barack Obama targeting the black population, right? And a lot of, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo with their books and everything, How to Be Anti-Racist, has really drummed up a lot of division between white and black people. And, that's their goal. And then with the students, who are the ones that are mostly right now your critical theorist, your wokist? It's your rich, white, middle class, mostly women that are sitting there and bringing all this. So it's exactly what Herbert Marcuse said. So your conspiracy theory isn't even conspiracy theory. It is pretty factual, and it's been laid out by some famous neo-Marxists and critical theorists. So you're not wrong. You're not wrong at all. So I want to talk about your new book that is coming out. And I know you'll probably go back to the last question I asked you, because that's the way we're rolling right here. So before we go do you want to talk about how your book were received by both sides?
Oh, yeah. Okay. In general, my books have actually been received relatively well in terms of my reception at conferences and so on. And I think that's one reason for that is just that the stuff in the books is pretty pure fact. Mm-hmm. I mean, like with Hate Crime Hoax, the reaction that I've gotten, if I wanted to take the other side honestly, is that is negative. The one negative reaction I've gotten is just, well, you need to work on definitions, sort of. Excuse me, like you're defining a hoax a little broadly, like you're defining any situation. So I actually have a 4-part definition of a hate crime. I mean, it's a situation that was nationally or regionally reported as a hate crime, with that in 96% or whatever the case is going into the police, where the incident that was alleged to be a hate crime collapsed completely. And there are different components of that. I mean, the collapse could be due to falsification by the person who was originally presented as the victim. It could be due to falsification by someone else. It could be due to the incident just never having occurred at all. So, I mean, you have that component. And I also require that the collapse be documented by at least one reputable national or regional source. And I have a list of, by now, about 1,000 individual incidents that are caught up in more than 800 case studies. This is concentrated in about 5 years. So again,
Jesus.
But the question is are those all hoaxes? And a real argument from someone like Barry Levin would be a lot of those are narrative collapses. So the noose was found and the entire media called it a hate crime, and the police began to pursue it as a hate crime because, again, there's a cutoff requirement, like all that would be involved. Yeah. But no one ever came forward and said that they had intentionally been victimized. Yeah. So who is the hoaxer? It's an interesting point. You can debate it.
It's not like
I would argue that the hoaxer
out there.
I'm sorry?
It's not like Jesse Smollett out there perpetrating it. It's clear. It's obvious that he's a bold-faced liar, yada, yada, yada. But again, so what you're saying is basically there's a lot of semantical of an argument with the left. They're not necessarily disagreeing with you, but it's a semantic thing. Like you need to be, you may not be wrong, but they can't admit that you're right.
that was the primary response to hate crime hoax. And the response to that is, okay, well, I mean, there are less than 7,000 hate crimes reported in a typical year. And when we looked, about 8% of those get the coverage that would be needed for inclusion in a national data set like mine. So you've got maybe 800 candidate cases being very kindly in a given year. And over the course of a couple of years, we put together, we'll call them collapses if you want, roughly 1,000 of those. So there's no denying that this is extraordinarily common, that among the highly publicized cases that the media latches onto, because I'm sure if some white guy says he got his ass kicked outside a hip hop club or Tejano bar or vice versa, like that happened. Like the guy lost a fight. You can add a hate enhancement. But in terms of these Jussie Smollett, Bubba Wallace, Covington Catholic kind of cases, a very, very large number, over 15%, just looking at the data, seem to turn out to not be real. Yeah. So that's just a point, and the point's made accurately in the book, and then you can engage it, you can respond to it as you see fit. Yeah. But so there really hasn't been a lot of rageful response to that. It just sort of is what it is. And the second book, Taboo, is similar. I mean, it's just one chapter is just the actual numbers on police killings. And again, this came out in early 2020 or a little before. So by that point, only Heather McDonald, Roland Fryer, fairly few people had written about this. So it was kind of surprising information. Yep. In general, what people, especially leftists, do with accurate information they don't like is just ignore it. So like Taboo for a while was an Amazon bestseller. It was like a week plus. I was on Tucker Carlson. Nice. I did a bit of left-wing media as like the guy in the upper left-hand villain box. I mean, so it was doing pretty well. And I kept waiting for those kind of reviews to roll in. I remember Charles Murray said he had a similar experience with his book Facing Reality, where he explained, I mean, you can agree with him or disagree with him on like the hereditarian stuff, which may well be the subtext there. I disagree. Actually, I don't tend to have a different culturalist perspective. But still, his comment was, I wrote this book. It's a well-written book. It sold X number of copies. And it's an obvious point that one of the reasons that there is so little business done in ghetto communities and so on is crime. Like, just ignore the educational stuff for now. Like, this is a very valid point for our moment. But almost nobody publicly reviewed that book. And getting to the point, the same thing was true with Taboo. I mean, I'd be literally on national TV, and the next day I'd look at the number of book sales. And then that week I'd look at, the treatment of the book. And people didn't pay much attention to it in, the Times, the Post, so on. So I think that was the most notable element of the response. Just there
kind
wasn't
of a compliment. In a way, it's kind of a compliment if they can't pick it apart, so they say nothing. So that's got to kind of feel good in a way that you did a good enough job where the leftists who love to rip apart this type of shit couldn't. So you have a new book coming out. Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. Sounds awesome. Can't wait. I got to pick that one up. Tell us about it a little bit.
Well, this book, and I actually, interestingly, because this is more about kind of almost historical controversies, although it's I think well written and entertaining, but it's about historical controversies where there are two sides. I think this will get reviews. Like, I think this will be assigned to like someone from the 1619 Project to rant about and so on down the line. And we'll see if that hurts or helps sales. Probably helps. But I mean,
engagement helps.
Yeah. I mean, so it's like the whole banned in Boston thing. Like, I don't really have any problem with that. And then I'll respond to the review on Twitter and a conservative magazine. Okay. But I mean, so the basic point of Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You, though, is that about 25, 30 years back, we had this whole wave of like best-selling, genre-shattering books. Lies My Teacher Told Me was one of them. But there are quite a few. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. I mean, like Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. There were all these people that had come up through kind of, I'm suspecting, the middle American educational system in maybe the 1950s or the 1960s, and probably had gotten that jingoistic education. And they were talking about things that at the time were considered pretty shocking, like, the Native Americans, we broke a lot of treaties. We killed a lot of people. This is the downside of America. But that is now kind of the mainstream in most high schools and colleges. To an extent, most people don't realize. Like, I just lightly mocked the 1619 project. The 1619 project has an educational curriculum that's used in like 600 schools.
Yep.
Incredible.
Yep. And it was
really
an uproar for a
incredible.
second, but then it just kept going. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I will note, I'm a member of 1776 Unites, which is kind of the Black business and social science community, or at least the right side of its response to 1619. And we actually have a curriculum over at 1776 Unites that has been downloaded by more schools. So again, in terms of like the Shamika being a normal person, I think the average guy who's Black coach in Mississippi or like a white principal in a functional Appalachian school, like they're much more likely to want to hear about American triumphs or just real history than how, everything in the country was invented by Black slaves in the Delta, starting 400 years ago. But the reality is that education right now is really, really slanted to the left. Like 1619 has a curriculum. It's used in much larger school systems than ours. There's another curriculum from the Zen Education Foundation, which is frankly Marxist. That's what Howard Zen set up. So I'm responding to some of the lies that are told today. So the book is pretty wide ranging. I mean, one of them is sort of slavery was unique to whites or the West, which is something Thomas Sowell responded to, again, 20, 30 years ago. So I'm kind of updating that. But I'm pointing out, like, there's a piece in the book where I point out, like, you can go on the dark net at this link and buy slaves. Now, you shouldn't. But, like, slavery... Yeah, slavery exists. I mean, it might be a little dated now. Hopefully no one's going to try and check it out. But I mean, like, there were open markets on the Libyan coast after our intervention during the Arab Spring, the Green Revolution, and so on, that sold blacks from sub-Saharan Africa, that sold captured whites. They probably just look like the old school slave markets where you could pick out a slave of your preferred sex and race and go home with them. Yep. So the idea that this was something that was unique to the Western world or harsher in the Western world, or that ended when we abolished it in 1865 is just nonsensical. So I break down modern day slavery today in places like Mauritania. Some of the chapters are a little less heavy. Oh, I will note one of them actually is Native Americans weren't peaceful. No, like, it's great to say. It's great to say, like, no, I mean, it's great to say, like, we broke the treaties too. It's great to say they were highly civilized. Many of them were magnificent cultures.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, like, I mean, they just found, like, the 400-foot-tall skull wrecks in Tenochtitlan in Mexico.
They used to scalp people, and when they kill them, they used to sacrifice them. And, no, they were not very peaceful. So I want to bring back real quick, because I have a radical educational thing. David's heard it before. And I want to get your opinion as a professor. I think we need to get rid of Black History Month, Women's History Month, and all those types of things, and teach prominent Black Americans, prominent female Americans in their proper place in history. I think it's offensive that we give Black people 30 days. Here, learn about every important Black person in America ever in 30 days. Here's 15 of them on Martin Luther King Jr., and then really throw in Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass. Oh, he could read and write as a slave. Cool. Like, that's honestly what you get out of it. And it's like, we learn about the same people every single year, and you don't really learn about them. You learn that, whatchamacallit, I forget her name. Rosa Parks was just so tired and didn't want to get up from work. Not that she was an activist doing this intentionally. You don't even learn that in high school. So it's like, my radical belief there is get rid of those months and let's teach them properly. Let's learn about Booker T. Washington. Let's learn about George Washington Carver and a lot of other, prominent Black individuals that could be in their proper place in history. So what do you think about that? And that's because you being in education, would education ever go for that? Or do they kind of feel pretty good about patting themselves on the back? Like, we love women and Black people. Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I think there are a couple different questions there. I mean, like, will that happen in the near future? No, almost certainly not. I mean, I don't see any major school system leading the charge to get rid of Black History Month. Should it happen? Arguably. I mean, I agree that the whole idea of having a History Month set aside for like Hispanics is pretty stupid. Yeah. Ideally, you would just incorporate well-known Hispanic figures into the curriculum. I guess at the simplest level, I agree. At the deeper level, I don't think the problem is the months. I think the problem is the extreme left slanted bias in education. Yeah. One. And two, I guess the idea of multiculturalism itself. So just like briefly, like for number one, Like Black History Month wouldn't be problematic if you just gave an honest overview of some very significant Black people and took them a little out of context. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's not really what happens. Like what you said about Rosa Parks is actually a chapter of Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You, where I go through all. Yeah, but like all of these great stories that have been kind of invented over time. Mm-hmm. And we see this happening in real time right now. Like Kyle Rittenhouse is a good example.
Yes.
Where like virtually until at least CNN started being reasonably honest during the trial and Fox was showing the videos and you couldn't avoid it. But like every young Black guy I shoot with or spar with, like almost literally everyone thought that Rittenhouse had killed 3 innocent Black people for absolutely no reason during a peaceful march. Because of the media narrative, free Black Lives Matter protesters protesting for Black lives during a Black Lives. And it was like, no, there was a bloody riot and he shot 3 white felons. Yes. Like it's just we see this narrative creation all around us.
It's pretty ridiculous. So I love what you're doing with your books. I can't wait for Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You. When is that scheduled to come out? Does it have a date?
Yeah, it's dropping this upcoming August, I believe. In practice, meaning that like electronic copies and so on will probably be available around July. But this next summer, it should be done. I can tell you the full draft. I was a little behind on the draft, actually, like a month plus, but the full draft is done. I'm now doing media about it and so on. Yeah. Oh, one last comment, continuing that like behind the curve sequence, but one last comment on the the issues with like Black History Month. One of the problems with multiculturalism is that most people don't know much about other cultures. No. Most people don't even know much. Most people don't even know much about their own culture.
Nope.
So when you say like we're going to incorporate a real understanding of the Aztecs into this history lesson, you run the risk of incorporating like a rid-washed sort of thin gruel Marxist version of history that some activist has written. And that happens probably like 80-90% of the time.
All the time. But we're also told Americans don't have a culture. We're told we don't have a culture ourselves when we do. And I think
I don't think anyone from outside the USA would have trouble identifying an American. Like I've traveled extremely widely and you can like I remember once I was in O'Hare Airport. And I was with a date, and we passed by a counter of people, and there were all these very flamboyant whites, sort of like there was this couple graphically making out. There were like people eating these funky cheeses, and I was like, "Oh, this must be Air France." And I said it's kind of a joke because it could have been any of like 10 European countries. But we passed around like the front, and it was like Air France direct to Paris, and I was like, "Oh, okay," because that's the stereotype of French people for a reason. They drink wine, and they're publicly affectionate, and they're not always perfectly hygienic, but they're scruffy style to them. You know, they used to be good at war, but I mean, like the same stereotypes exist of Americans. Like we're big consumers of product. Like we usually got logos on. We tend to be a little on the chubby side. We're also bigger. You know, like we tend to be loud. We're speakers of English. We do it in a different dialect than the British. We eat this sort of food. We've incorporated these great, Cajun and Hispanic dishes. Like it's not very difficult to identify an American. No. So there tends to be this glorification among a sector of our society of literally everyone but the world's most successful society, which I find bizarre.
So I want to get you out of here on time. We're in a little bit of a time crunch. So I have a few more things I want to ask you about. And I'm very curious, what is your opinion right now in the House, House of Representatives and Congress? There is the vote for the Speaker of the House going on. Now, Kevin McCarthy thought he was a shoo-in, already moved in to the speaker's chambers, which is getting more and more comical by the day. But now as of this recording, we have been through 2 days of votes, 6 unsuccessful votes for Kevin McCarthy. He's losing support by the vote, and he's being opposed by specifically 20 Republicans in the House of Representatives, led by Matt Gaetz and Lauren Boebert. And they are torching Kevin McCarthy every chance they can get. What is your opinion on the situation? Should McCarthy give in? How do you feel about it?
I mean, I think that I understand the anger of like the rebel Republicans, but at some level, this is a pretty stupid move. Like people always talk about how they hate voting for the lesser evil, but in that situation, the other options are not voting or voting for the greater evil. So, I mean, in a lot of situations like Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton, you can think both candidates are complete clowns, but whether you're a Democrat or a Republican really determines who you're going to vote for. Like, you're not going to flip and vote for the other candidate in that situation. So in this situation, like, I mean, a lot of the comments against McCarthy, like he's a quote unquote swamp creature. He's one of the biggest alligators in DC was a good line.
I loved it.
You know, yeah, he's Brooks Brothers suited down. I mean, all this stuff. I mean, that's true. The problem with this is that there's no alternative strategy. Like there's no one else that wants to be Speaker of the House. Mm-hmm. So like Jim Jordan is someone that if I were voting on the right side of the aisle, I would prefer to McCarthy.
Yes.
But Jim Jordan endorsed McCarthy. He seems to be a man of his word. Like he said, he's not going to run. He wouldn't even consider running for whatever it is, 2-4 years. So, I mean, he's not an option. Steve Scalise is a little more conservative than McCarthy, but also a guy who enjoys Brooks Brothers, and he's also not running. Like he would have to be begged out of his chair to be 2% better than McCarthy. So there's nobody there. I think that a lot of what like Lauren Boebert, for example, does, and no hate for her, she seems like a fun person to have a drink with, so on. But a lot of what she does is sort of alienate colleagues. I get this same feeling about AOC, by the way, who everyone loves on the internet, but who like went and protested in Nancy Pelosi's office once. And I mean, like a couple of months after she did that, I looked up the number of like bills co-signed by AOC, accepted by the House, and it was like 0. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, like there's an effect of doing that. Like it's all cool if you want to be an Instagram influencer or something like that after your 6 years. But if you want to get anything done, this is just useless kabuki. That's my honest opinion. That's my honest opinion. If you want to get anything done, this is useless kabuki. The person that's going to win on a plurality ballot, by the way, if they can't get this done, is Hakeem Jeffries. Like on every ballot, Hakeem Jeffries, who's a good politician, smart guy, but who's a left-wing dim, head of the Progressive Caucus. I mean, he's out-polling McCarthy right now as people get sick of this. He was at like 211 votes. So, I mean, you want to avoid a situation where you wind up with a Democratic Speaker of the House. And Matt Gaetz has openly said, like, I don't care. I might vote for Hakeem Jeffries. And it's kind of like, bro, somebody's got to do something. Somebody's got to bench him.
See, I have a different perspective. I love every moment of it because I lived through John Boehner. I lived through Paul Ryan. I lived through these guys that have done exactly what McCarthy is doing. That is saying he's going to do this, do that. And then he gets in and he goes, well, we have to play by the rules and we can't do this. And then he puts a bunch of other rhinos and uniparty members in committee chairs. And then we get a Benghazi style investigation, which is nothing. And nothing gets done anyway. And so, for me, I actually don't mind what they're doing because I think these 20 are actually speaking for the Republican base. The Republican base does not want Kevin McCarthy. There is not a single conservative outside of maybe his family that wants him there. So, for me, I'm okay with this. And say we get Hakeem Jeffries and there's a Republican majority. The government's now in gridlock for 2 years. That's not a bad thing. We're supposed to be in gridlock. The theory of the American government is gridlock, slow moving. If a majority wants a bill, then it gets voted in, right? So in theory, again, Hakeem Jeffries would be a disaster. I'm not endorsing Hakeem Jeffries. But Kevin McCarthy has no business being the speaker. And I don't mind what's going on. And I don't believe the man has an agenda outside of just keeping his Washington buddies happy. I don't believe in Kevin McCarthy in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I don't believe in politicians in general. I don't mean that as kind of a brushback. It's just sort of like, I don't believe in Hakeem Jeffries either. For that matter, I don't really believe in Lauren Boebert, who seems like a very nice person, but who is apparently a bit of a partier until fairly recently and ran Shooter's Grill restaurant until 2 years ago. Just like a nice person who had some straps,
There's lobbyists in all their ears.
Yeah, so I mean, like this whole thing, and although the idea of like a restaurant with people in Hooters Girl outfits with guns, I mean, there's definitely a market there.
Pretty awesome.
It sounds like a fun place.
Wouldn't mind seeing Lauren Boebert dressed up there. Not gonna lie.
Well, I mean, like I'm like, and as a dignified college prof, I'm not gonna like go into like, but like the whole Lauren Boebert history, like, wasn't she a model on one of those like kind of like hookup brand sites. Like she had a modeling page. If you Google like Lauren Boebert modeling, like can you hire for auditions and so on, I guarantee you'd find some interesting material on the internet. Again, that other people's personal and sexual lives have I don't care at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do think it's funny that this seems to be more consistently like that sort of partying, mid-sized town, used to get down kind of stuff, couple divorces, that's more common in the family values wing of the GOP because that's where it's common in society. Yeah. So like you've got Donald Trump out there like, yeah, I'm absolutely pro-life and I like our dignified Christian women. It's like, shut the fuck up, dude. I bought your dating book when I was like 19. Like we all know what you said. Like you dig up Howard Stern episodes. But anyway, like Lauren Boebert, nice persons, we're all in that. But just like, I don't think any of these people is necessarily entirely sincere about this stuff. McCarthy seems like a pretty typical, like big city, big guy. I think of like the old Mayor Daley's son back in Chicago. Like he'll do an okay job. I absolutely support like Chip Roy or someone who's a little more of, a purer breed, putting his feet to the fire. But you have to ask for something. You like release all the January 6th footage. Like if you're a hard body Republican. One thing they did ask for, the border security bill, guarantee you'll put it on the table by like this date X. So like he can say yes or no, but like in exchange for the McCarthy speakership, like we want X number of Freedom Caucus people in these spots. Mm-hmm. And except for the border bill, I don't think they've asked for any of those three things I just said. So like if you're competing in this kind of situation, you can't just say like, well, we're better Republicans. Like, okay. I mean, like, that's cool. But the other option is the guy from the Socialist Caucus. Like, so that's what actually happens with a lot of this stuff. Yeah. And I do think that there's an element of competence that you need when we're sparring with the Russians and the Chinese. And even we might laugh at this now, but rising powers like India, Nigeria, so on.
I've talked about India the whole time. I think India is the key in the, everything going on, because there's 1 billion people there. They have nuclear weapons. They have a pretty powerful army, and their wealth is real in that country. So, I've talked, there's no joke about India on this podcast. We've mentioned
there are a bunch of countries like that. Like, I mean, I was talking, one of my good buddies is Nigeria, and I was talking to him about Nigeria. We were like kind of making jokes about each other's countries. And I was like, you still got dirt roads out there. And he's like, well, at least we know what women are. But like, in addition to the banter, though, I mean, his comment was like, well, Nigeria, we now have the 29th largest GDP in the world. I looked this up, it's true. And he was like, I mean, we're also a black country in the sense that we, compete on par athletically with your brothers and rednecks. Mm-hmm. But I mean, our IQ is rising up to about your level. I mean, that's a real figure that we consider real in our country. We train for it. Yeah. We're the most educated group in your country. I looked that up, it was true too. Mm-hmm. I mean, so like there are a lot of these countries that take seriously the idea that there might be some tiny genetic or metacultural differences between groups, but also understand that 400 million people is a shitload of people, and that you can easily train past almost anything. Like the school day in India, Nigeria, South China doesn't look anything like it does in the USA. So, I mean, like all these people are coming, Pakistan. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think we understand that. Even Mexico, like Brazil. Like we kind of think of we kind of little brother those countries a little bit. There are 150 million people in Mexico, 237 million in Brazil. They're both richer than Mississippi. Yep. So like we tend to think of like, especially the Western hemisphere, is like us and a bunch of countries where people are riding around on donkeys and so on. I'd go to Ciudad de Mexico or go to Rio de Janeiro. I mean, that's not at all what it's like. Go to Lagos, go to Tokyo. So I mean, I think we are Dubai. They built a mountain. That's what the Burj Al Arab is, a mile high, 3/4 of a mile high. I mean, it's like, what the? That's literally a mid-sized mountain peak. It's 5,000 meters or something.
Incredible.
I mean, so when you are competing with these societies, I don't think it's a good time for us to be unable to define human sex, something I just joked about. But I also don't think it's a good time for us to be unable to pick leaders of the Congress. So that's my answer. I absolutely sympathize with the GOP dissidents, but they need to put some things on the table and then pick a leader. Sure. If Jim Jordan's willing to step up, great, but McCarthy is better than Hakeem Jeffries.
That's fair. That's a fair answer. I like it. So last thing I want to get to before you have to get out of here. Tragically, Damar Hamlin, Buffalo Bills safety, was tackling T. Higgins, Chicago Bengals wide receiver. Pretty routine tackle. I would critique the form terribly, but we're not going to go here nor there because it was a terrible form tackle. But T. Higgins, got his helmet into Hamlin's chest. Hamlin went down. They made the tackle, popped back up, and then almost immediately collapsed back to the ground. Scary scene. CPR performed for 8 minutes. Big time, athletes, football players who are tough motherfuckers crying, upset, visibly upset. Coaches and players call off the game. They refuse to warm up. Game is called off. I know Roger Goodell in the league is taking a lot of shit. I have another view on that, but people are going to say what they want to say about that. But my question to you is, if you scroll to Twitter, I know I was on Twitter a good amount because that's where the updates were coming from, right? That's this generation. What we do now is when you want to update in real time, you don't go look for breaking news on the cable news networks. You go on Twitter because the reporters are putting them there first. So as you're scrolling through, you're getting these reports, but you're also seeing reactions from a lot of prominent conservatives. And a lot of the prominent conservatives right away were, well, is he vaccinated? Well, the league made the vaccine mandated. This and that, this and that. Was he caused? Oh, this is like this. My question to you is, did you like the way a lot of the people on the right reacted? Did you think it was appropriate to handle it that way? How did you feel about that?
Well, like it, no. Feel it's appropriate, yeah. I feel the same way about Steve Bayless, by the way, or Skip Bayless, by the way. Yeah. So, Drip Bayless, but like, so, but okay. So like, just like going through this point by point. First of all, everyone does this. Like every time there's a mass shooting, like every one of my limited number of boys on the left is like, and just another example of how we won't restrain guns in this society. And like there have been incidents where this has happened where it turns out it wasn't technically speaking a shooting. Yeah. Like there have been mass casualty deaths in this country caused by cars, caused by knife wielders, so on down the line. So, I mean, we very definitely see that from all sides, more on the left, in my opinion, whenever a tragedy happens. Certainly. So first, is it legitimate for the right to do that about a bugaboo like a vaccine that turned out to be more dangerous if you read like the McCullough myocarditis papers than it was advertised as being, although it's still not particularly dangerous. The rate of myocarditis for healthy young athletes was, and this is not fatal, just myocarditis. It was like 1 in 5,000. Your risk of death from COVID, if you're in the healthy young athlete category, is also 1 in 5,000. So you can sit down and talk to your doctor about that, which is my advice on a whole bunch of things, by the way. Like talk to your doctor.
You're a science denier.
No, but I mean, like, just talk to someone that actually knows about it as opposed to like your boys on the internet. But like, anyway, so I mean, I think everyone does this. I don't like it. I think it's appropriate in the literal Latin sense of everyone engages in it and there is no penalty. I also think it is a somewhat reasonable question to ask. I mean, McCullough dropped the paper a couple days ago. So we know that the rate of, so like the whole myocarditis thing, the COVID vaccines are not killing tens of millions of people, I will say on a pretty large audience podcast or any of the other crazy stuff people say. However, a lot of the side effects that the government specifically lied about, like there's an increase of 10x of myocarditis in young men, we now know happen. I used to be an athlete. I suspect both of you guys were. It's the heart stuff is very worrisome. If you're out there running laps, you have some track that the heart issue will stop you. I mean, so there was that increase. We know that happened. Again, the actual number of deaths among men in the prime athletic category globally from myocarditis since 2021, it's like 1,600. That has to be 1 billion people. But that's an increase from like 210 or something. So this is a real thing that's happening. And I think it's pretty realistic for people to look at that and say, okay, we just saw this big paper about myo in athletes, and we just saw an athlete fall over. What's up? Again, tacky. Don't do that with guns. Don't do that with this. But it's what you expected. The one thing I will say about this, though, is when you just said like he was hit by a poor form tackle right before he collapsed. That's the other obvious element. Like the guy wasn't streaking down the field and then died. Just dropped. I mean, so what is it? Cogmodo? I'm not a doctor.
Cogmodo cordis? I don't know. CC. I'm calling it CC.
Yeah, CC. The risk of CC, which you see fairly often in baseball, which we've seen in lower division college football like this year, is probably about on par. If I'm 1,600 globally, that's a guess. I'm sure someone in the comments or whatever will say like, both of you are off by a figure of 37 cases in one hand.
Like that.
Whatever, when this is put up. But like, I would assume that there is probably a fairly similar level of risk with this reasonably common cardiac condition. And now we know this somewhat increased risk of myocarditis. So the reality is like you have no idea what's going on when you see the situation. It's best to hold off a little bit, but no, it's not stunningly offensive to comment because we're a comment society. Twitter's literally a microblogging platform and exists for that reason. I felt the same way about Skip Bayless, by the way. I mean, Drip Bayless went out there and said, like, look, there are two issues here. Like, one, he said this right in the tweet. It feels awkward to say this, feels like the game doesn't matter anymore. But how are we going to reschedule a game that's this important right before the playoffs? And this is a real question. Like, that's $1 billion question. Like, is there going to be some city that was in the wild card race or whatever? I mean, I'm more a basketball, baseball guy, but like, is there gonna, like, what's that one team that's in 5th or 6th right now in that conference that's going to have to consider what the impacts of this might be? That's
and
a real question.
The Skip Bayless thing was a series of tweets too. I saw one person on Twitter. There was 3 tweets, and the first 2 tweets were very much like, none of this matters anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
This isn't important. His life is the most important thing, blah, blah, blah. And then that final tweet was kind of saying what is kind of there, and then he ended it off by saying none of this really matters. So that last tweet was very much taken out of context because there was 2 other tweets in front of it that were kind of stating that the things in football stop mattering when something like this occurs. So Skip is not right about a lot. I think Skip is a caricature of a human, and I think he tries to be that way. He knows it sells, but he was demonized unfairly, in which we see all the time. Everyone's taken out of context, right? To try and make some virtue signaling point. So it is tedious at best.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. But also just like, this is something that really, so I'll say something forbidden here as we move toward the end, but like, this also was something that really bothered me under COVID, this like just one life sort of stuff.
Bullshit.
Like where I would say, like, look, we understand that the effects of lockdowns are going to be like, we're going to lose a couple points in IQ. We're going to lose trillions of dollars in value. All these teachers, all these other people are going to be sitting at home for a year. And I actually gave the construction example. Like when I did construction, it was very easy to calculate the value of a human life. It's brutal to do this, but someone in a leadership role needs to set a very high value, like $10 million, and figure out what we're willing to sacrifice in exchange for society continuing to operate. We're willing to lose 50,000 killed and 600,000 crippled every year so we can drive cars, and that's good. And people need to say, and that's good, or we'll all be fucking walking. So it's
riding those donkeys with Mexicans
who are now driving big Ford trucks. But I mean, like, they coming. But anyway, so like the whole point of all this though is like, obviously the people that were like lockdown denying science deniers were correct. I mean, we just did a cost-benefit analysis of the lockdowns. The cost of lockdowns is like $58 trillion. I mean, again, everything I say comes from a scientific paper, at least at the level of data. You can check that pretty easily. If you set a $10 million value per life, which we all know is not what they set on us on job sites, there's still no way that makes sense. Human life is valuable, it's precious, but it can't be the only thing you analyze when you decide whether people can leave their homes in a free society. You'd have no guns, you'd have no cars, you'd have no fried chicken restaurants, anything. So that's an ultimate sacrifice across. But anyway, so like, but it's kind of the same thing here where he's like, look, I mean, we're moving the major game. We're moving toward the playoffs. I'm putting this in tweet 5. I'm not saying this is the number one thing, but these are paid professional athletes. When are we going to reschedule the game? That to me is the 5th most important question. And it's just absurd to say that that's not the 4th or 5th most important question. That like every time someone's injured, we should cancel the game. This is like can you consensually date someone who's older or younger than you, given happy legal adult question from earlier? Yes, of course you can. Do women like rich men? Yes. Do most women have 9-inch penises? No. I mean, it's like
no woman has a 9-inch penis. Not most.
I'm not
0.
Saying Andre. But like that's the whole point with this. Like, of course, everyone knows that the question Bayless is asking is absolutely legitimate. Like in terms of the $500 million of value of a last week NFL game to advertisers, to players. Well, how many games for the guys that are first year? How many games do you have to play in? What makes you a veteran? Like there are hundreds of people, agents and so on, that are going to be asking these questions. And for one of the better known guys in sports punditry to say, okay, I'm going to step up and take take the hits. I'm going to ask these questions. That's not an evil thing. And everyone knows it's not an evil thing. What you're dealing with is the fact that no one wants to engage this hyper reactive mob of sort of shriekers online who represent like 1% of people. And everyone just has to start tuning them out. It's like when a non-abused child cries. Like, you already fed them, they're chilling in the next room, they're good. It's to see if you or your girl are going to respond. And if you respond every time, they will never stop crying. So you have to say, once, I'm going to be brutal, and then they're going to shut up forever. And I think that attitude needs to be applied to social media.
100%.
I agree with you completely. I found the strong thing on social media that the leftists don't know how to react to is when they say something, you just say, no, you're wrong. They have no idea what to do. If you just say, no, you're wrong. Well, what's your source? I don't need one. You're wrong. And they have no idea what to do with that. So, Wilfred, this was a great podcast. I really appreciate you coming on, my man.
Thanks for having me, guys. Enjoyed talking to you.
Once again, he is Wilfred Reilly. He is a professor of political science at Kentucky State University, author of Hate, Crime, Hoax, and Taboo, has his new book coming out, Lies Your Liberal Teacher Told You, coming out sometime in July or August. We'll get that figured out. We'll make sure we talk about it on the show when it comes to that point. And also go listen to Cut the Bull podcast with Wilfred himself, Charles Love, and Shamika Michelle. Once again, everyone, please like, share, follow, subscribe, give us a rating of 5 stars, spread this word of mouth, and we will be back next week. So long, everybody.